Welcome to the National Civil Rights Museum's Imagine an America podcast. Today's episode is King's Legacy, a drum major for justice. And our guests are Martin Luther King III and Arndrea Waters King, a husband and wife team for social justice. As the oldest son of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King III is a thought leader on the world stage, a peacemaker, and a negotiator on some of today's most critical national and international platforms for social change. Mr. King has devoted his life to promoting global human rights and eradicating racism, violence, and poverty, earning a reputation as a respected international statesman and one of the world's most passionate advocates for the poor and the oppressed. He serves as board chairman of the Drum Major Institute, the only nonprofit organization actually started by his father over 60 years ago. Arndrea Waters King is dedicated to serving humanity as a passionate leader in the global fight against inequity, injustice, hate crimes, and all forms of pain. As president of the Drum Major Institute, she plays a critical role in creating strategic partnerships and managing the daily operations of the active social justice organization. Through this work, Arndrea helps to contribute to the Kingian legacy and encourage individuals to embrace their unique contribution to peace, justice, and equity for all. Welcome to the Imagine an America podcast. We are honored to have you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thinking about the Drum Major for Institute and thinking about the language Drum Major for Peace, and thinking about how that has carried on throughout the years, can you share a little bit about that, the meaning of that language and how you translate that, if you will, to our current state of society?
I think, first of all, thank you for the opportunity for us to share today. We are truly always honored and humbled to be at the National Civil Rights Museum and all the work that is done to present the history of this nation in terms of the modern civil rights movement, because we all know that people that do not remember their history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. And this perhaps is such a critical time in our nation and world because of we've come to a point where division, hatred, a lot of disinformation and distractions exist, and it is not a method that we as a nation can continue without not just going in the wrong direction. And I mean, simply Dad characterized it, and Mom often, that we must learn nonviolence or we may face non-existence. Now, the Drum Major Institute, just to give a little bit of history, one of the last sermons that Dad did was February 4th in Atlanta at Ebenezer Church. And that sermon was called The Drum Major Instinct. And in that sermon, Dad talked about how we often want to be drum majors. And a drum major, we all know, literally leads the marching band. He or she, or they, collectively engage with their band, but they are where a lot of the focus is. And in life, we all sometimes want to be drum majors. But Dad challenged us not to be drum majors for own self-aggrandizement, but drum majors for justice. drum majors for peace, drum majors for righteousness. And from that speech also, he does his own eulogy. And when my mother, during this time in 1968, it was later on, of course, a few days later. I remember in '68, in fact, coming here on April 8th, 56 years ago, as a 10-year-old little boy, along with my younger brother, who was 7, Dexter, and my older sister, Yolanda. Bernice, our younger sister, did not accompany us, along with Harry Belafonte. And the climate then, people don't remember because we only think about Martin King Jr. as one who was loved and revered. But in 1968, at the time of his death, 70-80% of America, at least 75%, was like, this guy is controversial and didn't like what he represented. And because the climate was, I'm going to get back to your question, by the way. But because the climate...
You're answering my question. and some other ones too.
But because the climate was so turbulent, we'll remember that people were on pins and needles. And Dad used to say, violence is the result of the language of not being heard. Mm-hmm. And over 100 cities went up in flames. That was not what Dad would have wanted, of course, but he at least understood. And the issue is our nation maybe didn't totally understand, because you just look at these people being disruptive. Well, people, when you're pushed up against the wall and your back is, sometimes the response is irrational, and it could be counterproductive. I'm not trying to say that, I'm essentially saying people were just so frustrated and we were at a boiling point. Now, 56 years later, we may be close to some of that same kind of energy in this nation. And the message of Dad and Mom and what Arndrea and I are trying to promote is a message to bring people together. So if we're going to be drum majors, let's be drum majors for justice. Let's be drum majors for righteousness. Let's be drum majors for truth. And then really create community. Mm-hmm. Dad's last book, as you are aware, and many are, ironically and prophetically, is titled, Where Do We Go From Here? In 1967, penned, Chaos or Community? We really need to stop and focus on that. Chaos is not sustainable. Community can become amazing, and that is part of what we advocate.
Thank you so much, sir. And I want you to know that the title of your father's last book is the theme by which we are using as we renovate the building across the street. That is the theme. And the pillars that your father talked about are what's driving the material that will complement what is in the Lorraine Motel. And it's focused on April 5th, 1968 to the present. Because your dad's legacy will live on in perpetuity. And we're determined here at the National Civil Rights Museum to make sure that happens. You mentioned something else, sir, that touched me from the standpoint of a reminder to our society today of how people thought of your father. Obviously, the respect was there, but in 1968, he was not as beloved as we like to describe him by society at large, because his notions for radical nonviolence was not We weren't ready. We couldn't get there. But we have to get there. Ms. King, as the president of this amazing institute, can you say a little bit about what is happening today, the work that you're leading and the work that your daughter's even participating in, to push us to get there today? And feel free to use that word radical if you want to.
I never shy away from radical.
I didn't think so.
You know, I was mentored. I worked for many years for Reverend C.T. Vivian,
Oh, yes.
who is well known here in Tennessee. I worked for an organization that monitored hate groups and hate crimes, such as the Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazi skinheads. It was started by Reverend C.T. Vivian and Ann Braden, and I was so uplifted when we came through last summer, and to see C.T. Vivian and so many others, because this movement was truly a movement, and to see so many others, their stories told and the sacrifices being uplifted. But in answer to your question, one of the ways in which I talk about this is our daughter is 15 years old. She is the only grandchild of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. In her 15, almost 16 short years, she has progressively lost rights, she and her peers. And think about this, this is Dr. King's granddaughter. So, you know, she was born in 2008. In 2013, the Voting Rights Act, the crowning achievement of the civil rights movement, was basically decimated. In 2020, we saw a wave of laws that were passed that made it harder to vote, not easier. And we always remind people that there was a reason that Dr. King told us to give us the ballot before he told the world about his dream. When you think about in 2022, I believe it was, with Roe v. Wade being struck down, as a female, she lost reproductive rights and freedoms. When you think about the fact that in Georgia, our home state, history is being put on the ballot, and in some places illegal to teach history. When you think about the summer of 2023, affirmative action has now been made illegal in a lot of places. So this generation, so now a female girl child that is born, has been born the last 2 years in America, was born, and particularly a black female child, was born in this country with fewer rights than her mother, than her grandmother, her great-grandmother. We as a community understand that has not happened since the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of the passage of black codes. Because I think one of the things that people really don't realize is that segregation did not happen overnight. It was, you know, these laws that were passed one by one, which is why one of the things that we lift up at the Drum Major Institute is that laws should lift us all up, because we understand what happens when legislation is used to oppress. And unfortunately, that is what we have seen in the last few years, and that is the trajectory of what we have been seeing. But we fundamentally believe that you come from a place of power being for something rather than against. Martin's father talked about the triple evils of racism. We say racism and bigotry now, because we understand bigotry is racism's evil twin brother, poverty and violence. What we offer and what we want the world to see and understand is that if we are to eliminate those triple evils, it's through embracing peace, justice, and equity. And we also understand that, as Coretta Scott King reminded us, that freedom is never really won. Every generation is responsible for, I almost think of freedom as an eternal flame. And each generation is responsible for feeding that flame of peace, justice, and equity. That work has always been crucial, but it has not ever been more crucial than the moment at which we find ourselves at now. But perhaps it had to be that way because, again, as Martin father, talked about, that, it almost has to be when it's the darkest we look to the stars. And so we understand that this movement has always been a movement of faith. It always looked impossible until it was done. And so we are wanting to take that same spirit. We are wanting to ignite that movement, again, to feed the flames of peace, justice, and equity. One of the things that we have done this particular April 4th is we have acknowledged those that are on the front line of democracy, Black and brown-led groups. We've funded several with grants this April 4th because we wanted to acknowledge their work, to use our platform for good, and also to remind people that Dr. King was an activist. You know, I think we always think of him as a minister, which we should. We think of him as an academician, which we should, but we also must remember that he was an activist. He did not merely see that was wrong, he actually put his actions in to do something about that. So we are wanting to uplift those that are on the front lines that are continuing to do that work to build the beloved community. We also are working on a 5-year initiative called Realize the Dream. And with that, we are igniting a movement of service, particularly for young people, for all people, but particularly for young people. By Dr. King's 100th birthday, which is in 2029, we will have committed and completed 100 million hours of service. Can you imagine that? Mm-hmm. People coming together to do nothing more than stand together, be together, serve together, to do something to make their community a better place.
That is inspiring to hear. Several things in which you said, Ms. King, are inspiring to hear. And 2029 is right around the corner. Mm-hmm. The National Civil Rights Museum, fundamental to our mission, is to honor and preserve the legacy of Dr. King. Mm-hmm. And this notion of service, this notion of the importance of voting, this notion of participation of all in a spirit of activity and positivity is central to what we do. And so it's just exciting to be in alignment with the Drum Major Institute and the passion that you all bring to it. I want to come back to something that both of you referenced, and we did a little bit through Yolanda and sort of her, the image of her. Young people today, the combination of their appreciation for for days gone by, and recognizing that so much of today mirrors some things from years ago. And how do we communicate and engage with them such that there's a synergy that can be beneficial to society, and so that we're learning perhaps from them in a way that sort of flips how that generational determinant often comes about. How do you all capitalize on, I'll just say, Yolanda's energy and enthusiasm and insight for the work that you do?
Well, one of the things that we like to do is to remind young people that each one of us are dreams of the dreamer. Every one of us that are here, some type of way, particularly in the Black and brown community, but in all communities, we are the answered prayers of our ancestors. Somebody somewhere prayed over us. And it's interesting because we've heard Yolanda say that if her grandparents were here, the first thing that she would say to her grandfather is, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we still have these many problems that are facing us." And I think particularly as we look at April 4th and we get close to this date, to be honest, in our household, it's a lot of reflection. Mm-hmm. And even for Yolanda, which I think is mirrored by a lot of young people, there's this question of, well, what was it really about? Mm. If we are still facing all of this, or why did I lose my grandfather? But then she comes to the conclusion that, again, that this work, this time is more important than ever. And they are the generation. I honestly believe that we're witnessing probably one of the greatest, if not the greatest generations that we have seen. These young people are smart. They are bold. They're innovative. They're unapologetic. There is no coincidence that in recent years we've seen more movements by young people, whether you're talking about climate, and the fire drills, whether you're talking about violence and the March for Our Lives, whether you're talking about the fact of democracy and women's rights. I mean, a lot of these movements have been fueled by this generation. And I think we have to remind them that most movements have been started by young people.
Yes.
When you think about how old your father was, when you think about SNCC, when you think about actually movements all around the world, they have been started with that youthful vigor. And so one of the things that we hope to do is to feed that youthful vigor, give them the space, and also hopefully give them inspiration of those that came before them, and give them the freedom, though, to find their paths within that.
Let me add just one dynamic, because none of this happens some of it does happen in a vacuum, but it also is figuring out how do we use technology for good.
Yes.
Technology is absolutely amazing, but some of what happens today when it comes to information, the internet, the algorithms, all of that, we got to figure out how do we focus on good. We are probably using this much of a capacity that's bigger than our hands, this much. And it is those bright lights that we see these movements emerging, but that should be the majority, not the trash and all the things that are promoting and programming hate, separatism, division, anger, frustration, competitiveness in the wrong way. There's a constructive and instructive way that can happen, but we have to choose that. It does not happen on its own. So in addition to the great movements or the great examples that Arndrea has shared, which have created significant change, how do we, as we're thinking about it, how do we focus more on the good? There's a lot of good going on in the world that we don't even know about. And I would have to say that, unfortunately, our media structures, when you're analyzing, when you think about mainstream media, for example, and now even social media, the mantra is if it bleeds, it leads. And we haven't obviously said, that's a sick mentality. If it bleeds, it leads. Now, that's a marketing mechanism. And it has worked temporarily for marketers, and it gets people to want to look at negativity. If we can do that with negativity, we could do it even much greater with positivity. So, ABC every evening on David Muir, his 30-minute newscast provides news in the world, but at the end of the newscast, the last thing you see is always something positive and uplifting. Most of our structures, they may do that occasionally, but it's not every day. And so if we could somehow infuse our society with all the good, not that you don't report the bad, but we need an infusion of goodness.
Yes.
And that's what we are doing with Realize the Dream.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and I was going to ask for as our final question and reference back to that. I'd love to hear from each one of you. What are you hopeful about? What gives you hope, and something that you're that feeds that work for what you do?
Well, for me, I'm trying to get in before my wife. But it is. I've been greatly inspired just by what things that young people are doing, the creative things that are happening around movements. We were fortunate to participate indirectly, as Yolanda did directly, in March for Our Lives. And when I saw these young people from Parkland, Florida, put together a program that was national, if not global. And what I mean by that, they could have just focused on Parkland and themselves. They had violence in kids from Chicago, from Los Angeles, from Texas, from New York. And it was all about coming together to create a more safe and humane environment around guns. And, you know, Yolanda, in a sense, was sort of thrust on stage, and it was just an amazing experience. I was so inspired. I certainly, you know, it's interesting that our children can inspire us, because she created her own remarks. She didn't find out until that morning, which was a Saturday. We were just going to support these young people and what they were doing. And Yolanda had a speech. And I might add that we had gone to visit President Obama in his last year of office, because we were invited during African American History Month in February of 2016 to come and see the bust. We'd been to the White House, I don't know, 20 times over his 8 years in office, 30 times. But for whatever reason, we'd never seen the bust of Dad. So they invited us that particular year. And we told Yolanda, you need to come up with a question for the president. We gave her no more guidance. We didn't need to. And her question was, Mr. President, what are you going to do about these guns? Now, Parkland happened, I believe, in 2017. This was 2016. And then she spoke in 2018. And she had her speech already designed, which was, it's very short. I'm Yolanda Renee King, granddaughter of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. My grandfather had a dream that his 4 little children would live in a world where they would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream also. My dream is that...
Enough is enough.
Oh, my dream is, yes.
It should be a gun-free world.
Enough is enough, and we must create a gun-free world. And I'm like, my God. We didn't give her guidance, by the way. She told us. When Arndrea was helping her get ready, she said, no, I know what I'm going to say. And she's then 9 years old.
In true Martin and Coretta
Yeah.
King style.
Yes.
Like, Mommy, I don't need your help.
So I share that to say that that's one movement that's still going on, but there are many others. The women's movement by young women coming together around the world, and although it feels like we've slightly gone backward, that's not going to be sustainable, because the universe is going forward. It's humankind and some human beings who are trying to take us backward. It temporarily might feel that way, but this generation, and with all of us working together, have the capacity to move us forward in a way that saves humanity.
Thank you.
I love to read, and I'm a true lover of history. And one of the things for me that always gives me hope is I think to one of Gandhi's quotes. And he talks about that when he despairs, because I think sometimes people kind of forget that even when you're in this work and you believe in the best of humanity, there's still moments that you get tired or you despair. And Gandhi talks about when he despaired, that he thinks all through history that tyranny has never won. He said, and then he said, no matter what it looked like at that point, terror and tyranny has never won, never. And I think about that often, or I'll think about my father-in-law. I'll think about the times in which he was just so tired and weary. And Martin's mother said a lot of times he would preach himself out of depression.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think about the fact that even in spite of that, he and so many others kept going. I think about slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about how impossible that situation was, and our ancestors kept going. I think about women marching during their quest for women's rights and during the suffrage movement.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think about all of the millions of as many perished in the Holocaust, but the ones that Dr. Frankl that survived. You know, I think about all of the movements throughout history and how no matter how it looked, that tyranny, in fact, has never won. Someone told us that they heard Martin's father speaking once at University of Michigan, I believe. And, you know, he used his quote, he said his own quote, but he said it, I think, in a way which we don't hear often. And he talked about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But he also said that sometimes we have to get up and twist and turn and help bend that towards justice. And so when I think about all those things and I think about how far we've come, yes, how many more miles that we have to go, but how far we've come, how much we've survived. And I know that this is this generation's turn to do so. I know that there are no options to turn around. Yeah. You know, I know how we're being guided. When I think about this generation and I think about the fact that we're having all of these young people come together, stand together to do something to make the world better, to be a part of the world in which they want to live. I think about the fact that we have 200,000 teachers with the teachers union that have signed up to be a part of Realize the Dream. And so I do believe and know that we are, in fact, in good hands. I do know that although the dreamer is no longer with us, the dream is inside each and every one of us. And that the dream lives, and that love lives, and that hope lives.
Thank you so much, Mr. and Mrs. King. And the dream will be realized. We are full participants at the National Civil Rights Museum to support and to advocate and to reinforce the amazing work that you all are doing and will continue to do. And we are hopeful about the future. And we have an obligation as the place where your father and your father-in-law lost his life. We have an obligation to center him in what he stood for in our world. And we will do that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We encourage our listeners to subscribe to the museum's Imagine in America podcast series and follow the National Civil Rights Museum on our social media platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by the National Civil Rights Museum, located at the Lorraine Motel, the assassination site of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. It chronicles key episodes of the American Civil Rights Movement, examines today's global civil and human rights issues, provokes thoughtful debate, and serves as a catalyst for positive social change.